United States Army in Vietnam. During the last 200 years, the American military has fought 8 major. The source of its strength remains the same: men, young men.
I'm getting a little dizzy, so if I don't make it, just wish me luck, okay? I'm gonna go along with this room in your room in case something happens. I can get
okay.
One man, Thorne, help him across, will you, man?
Somebody give me a hand.
Stick with the gun.
American fighting men 10,000 miles away from New Haven and Watts, fighting another war. White men, black men. Today they fight as equals, and long before the violent birth of our nation, black men died in American wars. They died as equals, but they were not always allowed to fight or live as equals. And in most history books, the story of the black men in battle is usually ignored. The true history has many surprises. This monument on the Boston Common honors the first martyrs in America's struggle for freedom. Since the founding of American colonies, tensions between the colonists and the British troops had been building. On March 5th, 1770, these tensions exploded into violence. The British troops opened fire on an angry Boston crowd. A drawing by Paul Revere records this pivotal instant in American history, the Boston Massacre. The first to fall was Crispus Attucks, an escaped slave, a black man. This was the beginning. Revolution became inevitable. The colonial army needed men, but General George Washington did not want black men. Despite Washington's official policy, Negroes willingly fought against the British. The British officer who ordered the shot heard round the world at Lexington, Major Pitcairn, was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill by a colonial sharpshooter. His name? Peter Salem. He was a black man. While General Washington discouraged Negro enlistments, the British promised freedom to any slave who would join the Loyalist cause. This was the first of many attempts to undermine Negro support in American wars. Although the British had only limited success, General Washington was alarmed, and he called for an active recruitment of black freemen. When Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776, 2 Negroes were with him, Oliver Cromwell and Prince Whipple. Nearly 5,000 black men fought in the American Revolution. In 1813, a young America was at war again. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry didn't want Negro sailors, but the Battle of Lake Erie changed his mind. He later said, "They seemed absolutely insensible to danger. An act of Congress had restricted the Navy to able-bodied white males, but black sailors fought and died aboard American warships." In 1814, General Andrew Jackson actively recruited black soldiers for the defense of New Orleans. Until then, fear of slave revolts in the South had restricted black participation in the war. More than 600 free Negroes helped hold strategic positions against the British assault. Jackson's appeal had been to black men who were free. Most Negroes were still slaves. By 1860, growing pains had begun to split the nation. Slavery was a public symbol for the deep problems that led to the Civil War. At first, it was a white man's war. 11 days after Confederate troops opened fire on Fort Sumter, a free Negro volunteered to fight for the Union and was refused. The official policy in the North said that Negro slaves were contraband, captured property, not potential fighting men. President Lincoln feared the loss of border state support if he used black troops in the war. And meanwhile, from all over the North came offers of black regiments. From the South came escaped slaves who were willing to join the fight for freedom. Bearing the scars of slavery, a few were allowed to serve. They became symbols of new hope for black men, both and free. After months of costly and indecisive fighting, the North began to recruit Negro troops. It was an all-out war, and military necessity overruled racial politics. By June 1862, the first Negro combat unit, called the Corps d'Afrique, the African Corps, was organized. Black sailors were mixed with white seamen aboard fighting ships on both sides. The Union's Mississippi Squadron reported more than 800 black sailors. Negro sailors were aboard the ironclad Monitor when it fought the Merrimac. One Black River pilot, Robert Smalls, became a Union hero when he delivered his Confederate gunboat and its slave crew to the Union fleet. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The United States Armed Forces were officially open to all Negroes. Freedom, however, did not bring equality. The Civil War ended slavery, but marked the beginning of a segregated American military. Segregated Negro units were called United States Colored Troops. Former slaves clashed with slave owners. At Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, 1,000 black soldiers fought 2,000 white Texans in fierce hand-to-hand combat, but were finally overrun. Most black troops were non-combatants. They were laborers, cooks, and teamsters. There were also spies, couriers, and scouts. By the end of the war, 186,000 Negroes had joined the Union Army. Even the South had passed the Negro Enlistment Bill in 1864, but it was too late. More than 500,000 Americans died in the Civil War. 38,000 of them were black. After the war, 4 all-Negro regiments were organized and sent to frontier forts on the Western Plains. Their officers, of course, were all white. Saturday afternoon at the local movie house, most Americans learned that the taming of the Wild West was a matter of the white man versus the redskin. Few history books record the fact that when the cavalry rode to the rescue, troopers were often black. Black troopers died with General Custer at the Little Bighorn. They helped run Sitting Bull into Canada, chased desperados like Billy the Kid, and captured the Apache chief Geronimo. These are some of the real troopers who fought the Indians on the Western Plain. 14 of them won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Havana Harbor, February 15, 1898. 30 Negroes were aboard the battleship Maine that night. 20 lost their lives. When the Spanish-American War broke out, black troops were called from the frontier and shipped to Cuba. Within months, the all-Negro 10th Cavalry had saved Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders at Las Guasimas. Black soldiers played their most important role to date in the Spanish-American War. Black troopers fought at El Caney and joined the Rough Riders in the charge up San Juan Hill. "I want no better men beside me in battle than these colored troopers," said Colonel Roosevelt. But 7 years later, as president, Roosevelt court-martialed 3 companies of the all-Negro 25th Infantry when there was violence in Brownsville, Texas, due to discrimination against black troops. Tough and independent black soldiers refused to conform to servile white stereotypes. White hostility in Houston, Texas, 11 years later, provoked an even bloodier clash. Black soldiers of the 24th Regiment shot up the town, killing 17 whites. The result was a mass murder trial. 13 Negro soldiers were hanged and 41 sentenced to life imprisonment. When the United States entered World War I, Americans said they would make the world safe for democracy. The country mobilized, but Negro enlistments were restricted. Once again, however, manpower needs overruled racial prejudice. The Army's highest-ranking Negro officer, Colonel Charles Young, was retired as physically unfit for duty, even though he rode horseback from Ohio to Washington, D.C. to prove his fitness. The American military remained segregated, and most black troops were commanded by whites. General John J. Pershing, commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, earned his nickname Blackjack as a commander of Negro troops before World War I. Pershing had no objections to black combat troops, but many high-ranking officers and government officials publicly questioned the black man's ability to fight. During the war, more than 370,000 Negroes were in uniform, 40,000 on the front lines. Most black soldiers were relegated to service units. They were laborers, ditch diggers, and stevedores. Now, the 1st Negro Combat Division overseas, the 93rd, went into battle April 1918, fighting under French command. Homegrown discrimination followed black soldiers into the trenches. One document widely circulated in France openly declared that Negroes were inferior to whites. Despite this discrimination, black combat units fought well. The 369th Regiment saw 191 straight days of frontline action and never lost a foot of ground. Black troops won many combat awards, and they were the first to win the highest French military honor, the Croix de Guerre. For most Americans, however, the black combat record was obscured by controversy. One black regiment under American command was accused of sneaking to the rear. A government investigation found no basis for widespread criticism of Negro troops, but within 4 months after the armistice, all black troops were shipped home. Negro troops had been well received by the French, but exaggerated reports of black soldiers raping French women prompted American officials to get black troops out of Europe. In New York, Negro veterans were marched up Fifth Avenue through cheering crowds. Back home to Harlem. During the years between the two wars, Negro troops were reduced to less than 3% of the armed forces. After World War II broke out in Europe, America began a new mobilization. The 1940 Selective Service Act said there would be no racial discrimination in the selection and training of America's armed forces, but the military maintained its tradition of segregation. Public figures like Joe Louis became symbols for the recruitment of a black American army. Military thinking still relegated most Negroes to labor battalions, but some were trained for combat duties, even elite units. Elite, but separate. The pattern was clear. There were going to be 2 armies, 2 navies, and 2 air forces. One white, the other black. The military reflected a racially divided America. The armed forces felt that their job was to fight, not to lead social reform. Black America's Air Force began training on the Alabama campus of Tuskegee Institute. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was activated in 1941 under the first Negro West Point graduate since 1889, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. One of the first American heroes of World War II was Dory Miller, a Navy mess steward at Pearl Harbor. Dory shot down 4 attacking Japanese planes and won the Navy Cross. 3 years later, Dory Miller was killed in action. He was still a mess steward. Most Negroes in the Navy were messmen, and change came slowly. The Black American Navy in February 1944 included 2 anti-submarine vessels with all Negro crews. Their officers, with one exception, were white. The absurdity of a Navy within a Navy finally led Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal to order the integration of all naval vessels. Most of the fighting in the Pacific fell to the Marine Corps, and for 167 years the Marine Corps was all white. And in 1942 the Corps began enlisting black fighting men for the first time. As manpower needs went up, resistance to black troops went down. Segregation, however, remained. Military leaders argued that segregation reduced racial friction. In fact, it intensified it. During the war, there were racial incidents at home and overseas, from the defense plants of Detroit to base camps in Guam. In the Pacific, Negroes worked and fought at Guadalcanal, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima. Death and suffering made no racial distinctions. The 99th Pursuit Squadron represented a major departure from the military policy of using Negroes mostly as service troops. It was a token gesture. After years of pressure, black men were finally allowed to prove that they could perform the complex jobs of a modern military machine. The 99th established one of the best combat records of the war. Other all-Negro Air Corps units followed, and in all, 95 black pilots won the Distinguished Flying Cross. Two all-Negro infantry divisions served overseas, the 93rd in the Pacific and the 92nd in Italy. Public officials, military men, and war correspondents closely watched the 92nd's performance. On February 14, 1945, elements of the division were accused of melting away in the face of German resistance. Lack of faith between black troops and their white officers and a confused chain of command weakened the 92nd. Morale was often low. 90% of the unit scored poorly on military intelligence tests, and many had not been trained with their basic weapon, the M1 rifle. 542 Bronze Stars and many other combat awards were earned by the men of the 92nd. But controversy marred their record. One Negro officer wrote after the war, "When I think of what the 92nd might have been, I'm heartsick." The controversial record of the 92nd was widely publicized, although it was only one of the 4,000 black units that served during World War II. The German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, broke through Allied lines, advancing toward the Rhine. It also resulted in a breakthrough in American Army racial policies. 2,500 black volunteers were integrated into white companies on the front. Germans forced the first large-scale racial integration of the American Army. And after the battle was won, most of the Negro volunteers were returned to their segregated units. More than 1 million Negroes served in the American Armed Forces during World War II, half of them overseas. Black soldiers landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day. Negro anti-aircraft units fought on Normandy Beach, in Italy, and in North Africa. Black engineers worked on the Lido Road in Burma, the Stilwell Road in China, and linked Alaska and Canada with the Alcan Highway. At Anzio, black engineers unloaded nearly 2,000 tons of supplies under fire. More than half of the drivers in the famous Red Ball Express were Negroes. Black troops served all across Europe and throughout the Pacific. Many were decorated for bravery in combat. With the end of the war, America began to reassess the racial policies of the military. The enormous manpower needs of the war effort had already threatened racial segregation in the armed forces. Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis Sr., the military's highest-ranking black officer, began his career as a private in the Spanish-American War. His was a lonely career. A new era in the history of the Negro and the armed forces was about to begin. The black community had grown far more militant in its demands for racial equality. Black veterans came home and joined a new fight, the fight for civil rights. In October 1947, a National Commission on Civil Rights formed by Harry Truman called for a new government program dedicated to the elimination of racial segregation from American life. On July 26, 1948, President Truman signed a historic executive order. He declared, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." The job of changing a century-old military tradition of racial segregation began. At first there was resistance, but Secretary of Defense James Forrestal and Secretary of the Air Force Stuart Symington strongly supported the new program. "We're going to end segregation," Symington told the generals. "You've got to stop this double talk and act." War in Korea hastened the breakdown of America's segregated armed forces. By 1953, only 5% of Negro enlisted men remained in all black units. The percentage of Negro officers in the Army had doubled. One military report announced, "Efficiency has been increased, disciplinary problems reduced, and morale improved." Historic all-Negro units were integrated with white troops. A year before it was integrated, the 24th Infantry Regiment added a final victory to 81-year history. Black soldiers of the 24th captured the city of Yekchan, our first major victory of the Korean War. For the most part, the history of the Korean War was not a history of white troops or black troops. In the military, an order is an order, and the American armed forces had been ordered to integrate. By the end of the war, the military found itself in the forefront of the civil rights movement. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court handed down its historic school desegregation decision. The armed forces had ordered its civilian schools desegregated 4 months before. American soldiers returning from Korea had not only fought a war, they had lived an experiment. The success of racial integration in the military was an undeniable fact. For many Americans, both white and black, the impersonal discipline of an integrated armed forces was their first experience of racial equality. A little more than a decade later, America was at war again. The carrier Kitty Hawk launches airstrikes against the North Vietnam. In the war in Vietnam, black and white fighting men are fully integrated. 11% of the American population is black. In Vietnam, Negroes are about 20% of the frontline forces. Even more are in elite units. 14% of the Americans killed in Vietnam are Negroes. Young black fighting men along the DMZ and in the jungles around Saigon say, we're proving ourselves. But there's already 200 years of proof. The irony is that many of these young blacks and many white Americans think that this war in Vietnam is the first time black men have fought in an American war. The purpose of this has been to set the record straight.